My guest today is Riley Waggaman.
Well, I'm currently we're speaking to you from Russia, from Novgorod Oblast, which is between Moscow and St. Petersburg. And I first arrived in Russia actually a little more than a decade ago now. And at the time, I was in the southern Ural region. And after a few years there, I moved to Moscow and working in media. And this was right around this time of the basically when the the original Ukraine crisis started. So this was like 2014, 2015. And I basically have been hopping around Russia ever since. I lived in Moscow for several years, as I mentioned, and now I'm out in the boonies. But it's been quite an adventure. And now I blog about just issues related to Russia with a special focus on like health policy, technocracy, a lot of to some extent Russia's stance on climate change and so forth. Although I can't call myself an expert on it. I mean, it's such a huge topic. But yeah, that's what I'm up to these days.
Okay, I'm curious. Are you free to speak? Is there a lot of censorship there, or can you kind of speak your mind on these topics?
So what I would say is that first of all, it depends on who you are and what you're saying. But like many parts of the world, there's a in the Russian constitution, there's a guaranteed freedom of expression. But of course, this rule is just ignored, and you can just be arbitrarily punished for basically anything you say. But again, it's seemingly arbitrary in the sense that there are news stories of people being put in prison for basically saying nothing of any importance, and but the authorities just come after them for seemingly no reason. So yeah, it's a situation where I think the idea is just to make it so no one knows what the rules are, which obviously has a very chilling effect on free speech. Twitter's actually banned; it's blocked in Russia, and use a VPN to get around that. So yeah, like Instagram is blocked, Facebook is blocked, Twitter is blocked. Yeah, I guess it's a different social media landscape over here. They
Okay,
have
wait.
sort of their own logs, like, yeah.
You are active on Substack, though. Is that still okay, or how?
Yeah, Substack still, I mean, I feel like as a non-Russian and also since I write in English, um, my assumption is that I'm probably not a top priority for, uh, potential problems with I would hope not, with the government, but, 'cause my audience really actually isn't Russians. It's just Westerners who are interested in the country. So, I don't know. I don't know if that actually works against me or for me, but so far I haven't had any problems, which is nice.
So you have had really good exposure to podcasts and podcasters that I know about, like Ian Davis. You've been on Webb's Unlimited Hangout, and James Corbett. And I guess that's okay too. That you're pretty prolific on podcasts.
Yeah. Well, I'm not much of a self-promoter, but I do have readers who are go out of their way basically to email podcasters and say, "You gotta have this guy on your podcast." And so I think that's even what happened with you with, my, reader Vlad, who's a great guy. He's Russian, actually. I know where he's a great guy, but, yeah, so, if I get invited on a podcast, I do it. I usually don't go, like, hunting for them, but it's always fun just to talk to different people on the internet, because there's, like, all these ecosystems of people making a lot of interesting content, and I feel like on my day-to-day sort of internet activity, it's actually pretty closed. I sort of work in, like, a little bubble, and so it's really interesting just to break these, little internet ecosystem bubbles and discuss things with other people that, I'm not super familiar with, so.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I spent the last 24 hours listening to you on lots of podcasts, and I think your perspective is incredibly interesting and important as someone living in Russia to get a view for what's going on there. Because for me, it's mostly kind of a black box. I have no idea what the people are thinking over there. So I think it's great that you're able to speak like this and tell us what's happening. I'm just
Yeah.
curious about the whole view of climate change from Russia, the whole climate change scam, or what is the view of either the people or the leadership of Russia about climate change, do you think?
So, if I'm gonna generalize, I'd have to say that probably most Russians are either not at all interested in this alleged, climate change ideology or agenda. They probably either don't care about it or don't believe in it. They want nothing to do with it. But the leadership, actually, it's interesting how I feel like the climate change policies of Russia are quite reflective of how the government functions as a whole, of the general population, which is basically just doesn't want anything to do with all this, creepy global nonsense. And then the Russian government itself actually quite open to it, but they just want to be treated as an equal, right? EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM. Right, it's basically the EU's, what it does is that it taxes, like if you're importing cement or electricity to the European Union, they will put this they tax like the amount of carbon that you use to create these goods, right? So Russia, you would think that Russia's perspective would be like, wow, this is a massive scam. We're not participating in this. Like, screw you guys. But instead, it's sort of like, well, like, can't you like be nicer? And so what they're actually doing is they're just going to create they're want to create their own sort of carbon, taxing system within BRICS or with other, trading partners in the region. And, it's like they're basically just mimicking everything that the West is doing. This is how I basically put it, or they want to. And so they have various initiatives that we could get into, but I would say that they're probably years behind in some aspects of sort of, these bizarre climate related scams, but they're promoting it. Like they're on board essentially. Now, whether, again, with Russia, what's so interesting is that just because the government says it wants to do something doesn't necessarily mean it actually happens, right? So, like, how far is this scam going to get in Russia is an open question. I don't have an answer. I mean, some people would say it has no chance of success. I think that there are, but unfortunately, I would say there's already example. You have mandatory carbon reporting already in Russia. Uh, Certain sectors of the economy have to report like how much carbon they're emitting or whatever, right? So yeah, they started doing this stuff.
So we hear rumors over here that maybe the Russians are funding climate propaganda in the U.S. because they want to take the U.S. down and that type of thing. Do you think anything like that is happening or no?
Um, it's hard to say. I would say that I wouldn't give the Russian government that much credit. Like, for example, I have experience working at RT, which is like Russian state media, and what I found really interesting is that I wouldn't even say that RT has like an ideology that is trying to push. It's basically just nihilism in some sense. It will just publish anything as long as Russia comes out looking somewhat better than the United States. And so I don't even know if they actually have if they're actually pushing a particular idea at this point. They'll basically just try to they don't want to talk about what's happening in Russia, so they'll just throw goo at the West and the United States. That seems to be what they're trying to do.
So what is the mainstream media in Russia? Is it RT and a bunch of other stations or what is it?
So the main, there's a main. I'm sorry, there's a. So on television, at least, basically most of the TV stations are government run. So you have like Channel One, which is a major government station. A lot of older Russians probably get their news exclusively through state-controlled television. You have TOS, which is a major, um, that's also state-run. RT is, I would say, as popular. Like, there is a Russian language version of RT, but I would say that RT is actually primarily more popular in the West, I would say. But then there's basically just like a lot of the Vedomosti, which is sort of like the Russian Wall Street Journal, I guess you could describe it like that. So it's more sort of business focused. But and then what else? You have like Commerçant, which is all sort of more business focused. And then you have just like all sorts of websites that are sort of news entertainment focused. I would have to say in general that even the non-government run outlets are going to basically not be super critical of what's happening in Russia for various reasons, whether it's just because of censorship or also just because just as like in the United States, like so many journalists are, they seek validation from power. They don't question it, right? So it's the same. It's the same kind of mentality that you'll find the same kind of mentality here in Russia. The people who are in media don't actually want to question things. They want to be validated by the people that they're supposed to be questioning. So you have the same sort of phenomenon here in Russia, absolutely. Having said that, there are a lot of really interesting, smaller alternative news websites in Russia. Who, they're Russian, they write in Russian, and also Telegram is a very, very popular um, source of sort of alternative information and news sharing and commentary. And if you want to get a really good idea of what's happening in Russia, you should just join some Russian Telegram channels and, I don't know, machine translate it because there's a lot of interesting stuff being talked about in this country.
So the average person, though, in Russia, if they're exposed to the mainstream media, every time there's a storm, or is it really pushed that CO2 caused this storm and we got to fight carbon dioxide, or how big of a deal is that?
Yeah, yeah. So I would say that in general, like when this kind of stuff happens, you don't have the same kind of climate hysteria. So, when there's a hurricane in the United States, you'll have, the governor saying, oh, it's because of climate change. I don't know if Russia's at that level yet, they've signed on. For example, they claim that they plan on being carbon neutral by 2060. I would say that it's definitely at this point, it's very much a top down sort of thing. So the average Russian hasn't really bought into it or isn't invested in these narratives, but the government and, you have the academics and scientists in Russia are definitely on board with the agenda, with the scam, basically.
How about Putin himself, though? Do you think privately that he actually believes that CO2 is causing bad weather?
So Putin's, I would say that if you looked at the way that Putin has discussed climate change, I would say that there has been sort of an evolution. I think maybe the first time he really started talking about it was maybe 10 years ago. Maybe you can go back further and find other evidence, but well, whether you believe it or not, who knows? But he claims that he thinks it's a serious issue. I believe that he's also said that he believes it's man-made. The difference, though, with Russia's climate policy and the West is that Russia has, over the years, it's slowly dropped any mention of fossil fuels from like the way that its policy papers on combating climate change. So they have the same sort of lingo that you'll find anywhere else, and they sign off on all of the UN thing, climate statements and IMF stuff, but they don't talk about fossil fuels just because it's an absolutely huge industry here. And so they're still very deeply invested in fossil fuels. And so I don't know how they're gonna make this all work together. If you really bought into the scam, they're gonna have to find some ways around this. But they're very heavy on they're promoting nuclear as an alternative, as a clean energy. That's a big thing for Russia. I guess what you could say is that they basically accept the underlying narrative and lies, but they just are trying to find some way to I don't know, somehow not have to give up fossil fuels. I don't know how that works, but yeah.
I mean, do you see a lot of new solar facilities going up and a lot of new wind turbines going up or not right now?
I haven't seen them, and I wonder. I That would be a really good question or thing to research. Like, how much has wind and solar entered into the Russian market? I would assume not a lot. Have said that there's like these interesting pilot projects. I think the most famous one is on Sakhalin Island, which is like the far east, Russia's far east, off the coast of Japan. Like this large island network, and they actually are creating what they call it like ecopolis or whatever. It's like a green city. So they're designing an entire town of 25,000 people that's supposed to be completely carbon neutral by 2025. And this is where they're doing test runs of like their carbon trading system and all. It's really weird. It's like this little experiment site for all these really creepy, green projects. And so again, it's like, okay, this is really disturbing and really messed up. It's still very small scale on the bigger, at it from 40,000 feet. I mean, it's just Sakhalin Island and, Russia's a pretty big place. But you look, all these things, I'm sure, all it takes is to get a foot in the door. And unfortunately, these ideas, they metastasize, and within a few generations, maybe it'd be totally normal to have an ecopolis, I don't know.
Are they seriously trying to go carbon neutral by 2025 or some later date or next year?
So in Sakhalin Island, they claim that goal is to be completely carbon neutral by next year. the end of next year.
There's absolutely no way, right? They got to cheat.
I know, yeah. No, yeah,
100%.
I mean, of course. Yeah, no, it's such a massive I mean, I don't I try to read this stuff, and even when I think I understand it, I just don't understand, like, how this is possible. What am I like, what's actually happening? I don't how did things get to this point? It's just unbelievable.
So, do you think that Russia is going to try to use this whole climate scam to really clamp down on people's lifestyles using central bank digital currency or the digital ruble?
I think it's absolutely I mean, n it's a very real possibility. I think the question really here is timeline, right? Like the time frame we're talking about, whether this something like that is coming in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Um, but look, I mean, I'll just give you an example. Already, when you buy a train ticket, so when I occasionally I have to go into the big city, so I take a train to Moscow, which takes, depending on the train, anywhere from 2 to 7 hours. But on my ticket, which is Russian Railways, so it's partly or maybe entirely owned by the Russian government, it has a statement saying how much CO2 I saved by riding on the train. You know, and it's just and okay, it's a small thing, but look, you buy your ticket, it's almost always I don't even know if you can get them issued on paper anymore, so it's all electronic, and so it's not difficult to imagine a situation where you have your, electronic CBDC on your phone, they connect it to your train ticket, you have a certain amount of carbon you're allowed to on this is not unfortunately, this is not some fantasy anymore. The the building blocks are in place to create such a system. It's just a matter of how much time it would take and how much political will there is to do it. But it can absolutely be done. We're already seeing, I think, the opening, stages of a system like that.
So, I think you've said elsewhere that digital ID is a pretty big deal over in Russia in terms of, I think you said that kids, when they're paying for their school lunches, are paying with their palm, that type of thing.
So they've run. So first of all, there's this. It's absolutely. I mean, it's dystopian, but also pretty funny. Russia's largest bank, Spare, which by the way is also very involved in climate issues and ESG compliance and all this other stuff. It's run by this very creepy guy named Hermann Gref, who is a former board of trustees member of the World Economic Forum. This guy ran this test, this pilot program where, yeah, it's biometric payments for school lunches where you put it's called little palms and you put your palm on the scanner and then you pay for your school lunch that way. That's, I believe is still a test program. However, Sberbank has started this pay with a smile technology. That's what they call it, which is their biometric payment system. Which is, I mean, it's so creepy. It's so cynical, but and they have these little kiosks now. You go to the store and there's a little screen, and if you want to pay biometrically, you can. And I'm telling you, a few years ago, you couldn't find any of these, and just over the last 2 or 3 years, these little biometric kiosk payment systems have popped up not just in Moscow and St. Petersburg, even I live in a tiny little village, and the closest town to me is about, 20 miles away, around 30 kilometers. And even in this tiny town, 2,000 people, I go to my local butcher shop, and they have a Sberbank pay with a smile kiosk. It's wild. And this butcher shop looks like it's from the 1970s. Like it's very old school. And then you have this like really creepy, dystopia Sberbank pay with a smile thing. It's wild.
Can you still pay with cash most places or all
Yeah,
places?
yeah, of course. And look, I want to be really clear. I'm sure that only a small fraction of Russians right now are actually using this option. That being said, I really do believe that the things that we consider taboo or ridiculous or crazy, this is just conditioning, right? So all it takes is a few generations. If you teach children from a young age, yeah, it's cool to have a smartphone and to pay biometrically. It's safe and convenient, and you don't have to carry around cash. Cash is dirty. Cash can carry viruses. That was the big thing during COVID, right? And so we got to get rid of the cash and pay with your face. It's pay with a smile. And to me, it's not at all ridiculous to believe that within 10 years, biometric payments is going to be is going to be totally normal, like using a debit card. Which, by the way, 30 years ago, people were really by paying with plastic, but now it's totally normal. And by the way, there's already in some parts of Russia, like for example in St. Petersburg, you cannot pay for public transportation using cash. If you don't have a card, you can't buy a ticket. So yeah, it's pretty wild.
I'm curious, as a lot of people are paying with stuff using QR codes in their phones, or are people, almost everybody
Yeah.
has a smartphone, and is it an iPhone or Android, or what do they have over there?
Yeah, so like contactless payment systems are already actually quite large, where you basically have like a digital version of your debit card or your credit card, and you hold your phone up to a little screen. That's actually pretty common here. I'm not going to say not as common probably as physical debit card, but it's definitely gained traction. People have iPhones here. It's a status symbol. Russians love iPhone, like a lot of people around the world. I don't know. I never really understood the iPhone thing, but yeah. I mean, they have everything. They even have. There's also a lot of the Huawei, like the Chinese phones, and but they run Android and whatever. I'm not really. I know very little about phones. I'm sort of a Luddite, so. But yeah, people love their phones, even and especially the kids. They love phones in Russia. They're all on their phone now. It's scary.
I'm going to read a good quote that I saw in one of your recent articles. It quotes, "The good news is that the Russian government might be too incompetent to fulfill Putin's dream of a CBDC paradise." Uh, you still, you still stand behind that? Do you think that?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, look, so yeah, just for people who might not know, I mean, it be shocking to some people, but Russia actually adopted the digital ruble, which is central bank digital currency, which is completely controlled by the Russian central is also IMF obedient, just like every other central bank, and there's no direct oversight. Like it's not part of the Russian government; it's an independent entity. And so the CBDC, the digital ruble, was made a legal form of currency in Russia last summer. Sorry, not the most recent summer, 2023, and they plan on actually they've been doing small scale tests, and they plan on introducing it into the economy starting next year, starting next summer, 2025, summer 2025. So the question, of course, is how quickly can they actually get this into circulation, and whether Russians will agree to use it. And I do feel like basically the only thing stopping it at this point is whether the Russian government has the ability to push this on people or not. You know, probably the way they'll do it is by issuing pensions and salaries if you're a state employee, because they actually, in some ways, they already have a system like that. They have a alternative to Mastercard and Visa called Mir. What they've done is that to make Russians use the Mir payment system, they issue pensions and salaries if you're a state employee, and that's how they basically force people to use this, alternative system, which is controlled again by the Russian central bank. So if they decide to do that with CBDCs, that's one way to force it on the population. Of course, using this kind of technology, how are you going to get an 80-year-old Russian to, first of all, get a smartphone and get a wallet and figure out how to use all this stuff? There's a lot of hurdles here, and so I do think that there's a possibility for it to all just stall. There it might just hit a wall, and that's what I'm praying for. So fingers crossed. But yeah, who knows who's coming? We know what comes ahead in Russia and the rest of the world. I think, unfortunately, we live in a time where anything is possible. So yeah.
Would you say that the average Russian isn't really awake to the danger of CBDC because they got other stuff? They're living their lives, and they haven't really they haven't looked into this, so that they're afraid of it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So it's going to be the same as, in the United States or the EU. I mean, even those who might be concerned about it, they just either don't have the time to think about it or just haven't been informed about it. Russians have mortgages to pay. They have things they got to do. And who wants to think about, the dangers of a CBDC? That's something that people just want to block out. And even if I think that even people who do understand the threat don't, it's hard to process. I mean, even for me, and I research this stuff, I write about it. It's very, very scary though to think about digital currency, a centralized digital token that can expire or, be painted in a way so that it can only be used to purchase certain items. This is really end game, terror. And so to actually think about what the CBDC represents is not a fun thought experiment.
How about the whole issue of inflation and money printing by the government? Is it as big a problem there as it is in the US? I wonder.
Um, that's a really good question. I've seen like apparently, allegedly, actually, the money supply, the paper money supply at least, is decreasing. And the reason for that is because Russia has a 19% key rate. The interest rate in Russia is 19%. So if you go to a bank right now and you deposit, your money, you're getting 19% on that, or a very high interest rate. And allegedly, this insanely high interest rate is supposed to make up some ridiculous reason for it, to stop inflation. But inflation is actually, I believe, at a quite it's accelerating. And depending on what you're buying, it could be quite high. It's definitely no better in Russia than, we're talking about with at least with food prices, we've seen very, very large jumps in prices. But what this key rate has also, of course, is that it's made it very difficult to take out loans and like create, like you need if a bit needs money, like some seed money, how are you gonna pay back loans at that rate? And mortgages are also extremely high here. So anyway, the apparently people are depositing their money, which in some ways might be a little bit frightening because now there's less paper in circulation, which would actually help, I guess, benefit a transition to non currency and payment systems. But as far as printing, like the creation of money, uh, what's been interesting is that the current, sorry, I can't call it a war, but the current conflict in Ukraine, you're not allowed to call it a war here, is that, yeah, it's true. Is that you have like a huge jump in expenditures. And I believe that although the Russian deficit is nowhere near the level of the hole that the United States finds itself in, they're running a pretty large deficit by Russian standards. And they're also, what they're doing at this point is that they're paying people, they're basically relying on contract soldiers now. And so they're paying huge bonuses. Like I'm talking about the money that maybe like 2 or 3 years worth of salary for some Russians to go fight. And, where's this money coming from? So clearly money is being created out of nowhere. So it's the same basic system. And Russia even has this thing, sort of like a rainy day fund called the National Welfare Fund, which was supposed to be for, if there's any sort of economic problems and we have this giant chunk of change. And I've read reports that they've basically drained about half of this fund in the last year and a half, which is really incredible. So I don't know where that's going to go. But anyway, to answer your question briefly, inflation is absolutely a problem. Although I wouldn't say it's reached a critical point, but allegedly, the amount of cash allegedly is being reduced. And yeah, I don't know. You have, I mean, again, I think it's so funny how people try to paint Russia in direct conflict with the rest of the world, when really there's no ideological difference. I mean, it's the same sort of neoliberal economic policies and insane monetary policies and stupid climate scams. Basically, anything that in almost every instance, the only thing maybe being a few like social policies related to like LGBTQ stuff, but everything else is you could basically just assume that Russia is doing the same thing as the rest of the world. Like that's the best way of understanding Russia. It's surprisingly not that different from the government level, you know?
So, from the perspective of us in America, we might think that people in Russia that they're consumed by the conflict, and that's all they talk about and think about every day is the conflict in Ukraine. But you've said elsewhere that's not the case, right?
Yeah, people don't want to think about it. They don't want to talk about it. Um, I really think that I mean, it's of course it's a horrible tragedy. By the way, it's just like unbearably tragic what is happening. And I think that most Russians at this point understand that something went horribly wrong. The assumption was, because I was here, when it all kicked off in February 2022, that this conflict would last, maybe a month, and there'd be a settlement and go back. And unfortunately, the exact opposite has happened. And now, parts of old Russia, like Kursk Oblast, are occupied by the Ukrainian military. It's absolutely crazy because now you have. I mean, it's almost hard to. I can't believe I'm saying this sentence that I'm about to say, which is that Russia has been invaded by a foreign army backed by NATO, and nobody in Russia seems to care. Like nobody talks about it. Nobody cares. People are just going on with their lives. It's really shocking. And I know a Russian, by the way, who lives less than 100, like maybe I'm talking about maybe somewhere around 50 miles from where there's currently fighting in Kursk Oblast, which again is Russia. And he says that in his town, nobody cares. Nobody wants to talk about it. No, you don't hear anything about it. They just want to talk about, buying a new Chinese car or whatever. It's wild. It's wild.
I wanted to jump back to what you said about ESG and DEI. That is less big in Russia, do you think? Well, it has to be than in the US. Less craziness on that stuff.
So this is another really funny example of how, Russia, despite all of the, geopolitical tensions with the West, for some reason is still pursuing this ESG nonsense. And so I mentioned this bank, Sberbank, and Hermann Gref, this creepy guy. And, really interesting again is that some major, like they've been basically leading the way with like making Russia ESG compliant. And so Sberbank has all these weird like green initiatives, and they set up Sberbank with some other large corporations in Russia, some of them state owned, created called the ESG Alliance, the National ESG Alliance, which is a group of Russian companies, and they all get together and, stuff. Like, I don't know what ESG is. Like, can you explain it to me? I've read about it, I've written about it. I still don't like, what is the point of this? Like, what are they trying to do?
Yeah, I can't explain it. To me, it's like woke BS. That's like,
Yeah, right?
yeah.
It seems like they're just like trading press releases. Like, yes, we're very sustainable and we love the environment. It's like, okay. And it's so weird. And recently there's two pretty forums in Russia. One of them is the St. Petersburg Internet Forum, and one is the Eastern Economic. Wait, is it called the Eastern Economic Forum? I should know. Yeah, the Eastern Economic Forum, which was held recently in Vladivostok, and every year that this has been happening since I've been following this for about 3 or 4 years, like they have dozens of panels on how to make your company ESG compliant, how to go green, how to embrace energy transitioning, and all the buzzwords, all the word salad that to me is just absolutely incomprehensible. I don't understand why they waste time talking about this stuff. And what's really interesting though is that even with the geopolitical tensions, it seems like Russia is now believes that it's important to embrace this stuff because China is also in on it. And so they want to be a responsible trading partner with their Chinese partners and their Indian partners. And it's like, it's just incredible. You can't escape it.
Yeah, to me, the whole thing, I mean, a lot of it is based on the climate scam, and that whole thing is to prevent imaginary CO2 induced bad weather. Doesn't exist. So the whole
Right.
idea that any of
Right.
this is going to prevent any bad weather, it's all BS. So, yeah, I think that's the root of the whole thing. I wanted to quote you again here about you said, if you're looking for a one sentence summary of the pact for the future, it would have to be, quote, our friendly and selfless governments promise to turbocharge the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So you just wrote about that,
Yeah.
right? That there was no vote on this. They just went off and did this thing with no vote, correct? Yeah.
Yeah. So I didn't know this until I wrote this article, but apparently in the United Nations, when the General Assembly meets, like 80% of their resolutions, there are no formal votes. They have something called consensus, which is basically when there might be countries that don't like certain parts of a resolution, but as long as you can basically twist their arm and make them not object or ask for a vote, nobody calls for a vote. And so it's by consensus. So even I was reading the literature published by the United Nations on their website, and they're like, listen, consensus doesn't necessarily mean a majority. It just means that nobody wants to object. It's like, wow, I love world government. This is an absolute madness, you know? And so what was really weird about this is that Russia had all these objections, but they still allowed consensus. And then afterwards, they were like, well, we don't like certain parts of this. So we just want to make it clear that we're not in consensus with certain elements of this thing that we allowed to pass by consensus. Like, what is this? Like, what is the point of this? What's the point of the UN if this is how it functions, you know?
I wonder, have you looked into this C40 cities document? This is my favorite crazy document that says by 2030, we get zero meat, zero dairy, and no more than 3 pieces of clothing, new clothing per person per year. It's still spelled out. It's still online as of right now. And I think it doesn't get any more crazy than that.
That's absolute. I've heard of this. I'm not super familiar, but that sounds wild. I mean, it doesn't surprise me, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, you know, I feel like they always overshoot, right? I think that's even part of the strategy is that they overpromise and then, you know, they say, well, we'll like, as long as they get the foot, right? As long as they create their little beachhead of weirdness and little by little, they chip away at sanity and common sense, you know?
So do you think, though, that Russia is one country that is pushing back, at least to some extent, on this crazy stuff from the UN?
No, actually, I don't.
Okay.
I think that Russia, it is fully on board, but it doesn't want to be a junior partner. It wants a big boy seat at the, you know, the global government table. And so I think that a lot of the, you know, the conflicts and the wars are real, of course, but it's not because the United States loves democracy and Russia's trying to stop, you know, the climate change scam. It's because they're all in on it together. But you know, it's like 2 drug cartels fighting over who gets to deal heroin on that street. You know, like I have this quote that I found. You know, before I spoke with you, I was just trying to review my Russia related climate scam information. I had this really amazing quote that I found that I think you'll find very interesting. I'll read part of it to you. So this is it was said by the Minister of Economic Development in Russia. This guy named Reshnikov. Anyway, so this is what he said. Climate issues haven't gone anywhere. What's more, it's clear that with the situation we have today, carbon prices in the world, we will see the further development of alternative energy and wind and solar and all other areas, including energy conservation. There will be a lot of major shifts, and the climate agenda will be, shall we say, at the forefront of all these shifts. That is the first point. The second point is that the normalization of the agenda and the normalization of relations, which will happen sooner or later, will in all likelihood begin with climate-related issues. Therefore, we must be ready in this regard. We must not fall behind. So, according to the Russian government, they think that the climate agenda will help create normalization, you know, right? Will help mend ties and everything will all be buddy, kumbaya, happy friends with our, you know, carbon credits and bizarre, you know, environmental scams. It's like shocking.
So I heard that right, that seriously, this is going to unite the world. This is going to be the thing, the fight against carbon dioxide.
And that comes straight from the mouth of a Russian minister.
All right, I'm going to go out on a limb and say there's 0% chance that that's going to happen. That's completely freaking crazy. What do you think of the whole Bitcoin thing? Is it banned in Russia or what's happening?
It's not. There's regulations on it, and so I want to choose my words carefully because I'm not super familiar with them, but my understanding is that they're not banned. They can't be used for like purchases. So you can like use them basically as a way of just holding money, you know? But you can't like do business in Bitcoin here. And yeah, that's basically my understanding of it. I do believe that there is also the Russian government has been toying with, you know, like Bitcoin mining, or there's some regulation about it and that it is happening here, but with some, I don't know. I should know more about Russia's position on Bitcoin. I'm overly familiar, but it's here. It's in use. I wouldn't say that it's as widespread as it is in the rest of the world, perhaps, is what I would say.
There's a possibility that the Russian government might do some Bitcoin mining or just allow it, you think?
I think just allow it. I think just, and which I think is already happening, I believe, and I think it's legal. But please don't quote me on that. I should read up on that. Yeah.
Okay, so there's the view of Putin over here, maybe that he is like some combination of Hitler and some evil genius, and he's playing 4D chess to take over the world. Is any of that close to reality?
Yeah, the thing that's so interesting about Putin is the way that he's portrayed, it's such a bizarre caricature. And so, yeah, one common narrative in the West is that this guy's, like the next Hitler, and he's coming after, he's hiding under your bed, and he's gonna steal your democracy and freedoms or whatever. But then, on the other side, you actually have a lot of disaffected Westerners who are sick of their own government, and they idolize Putin as this, brave champion of common sense and decency and the multipolar world order that we hear so much about. And I would argue that Putin is neither of these things, that he's actually incredibly boring. He's the center of a road, say anything to stay in power. He's a politician who likes power and having rich friends. And I don't even think he has an ideology. I don't think he's really motivated by anything like that. So it's just funny to see how he's portrayed. And I would say that the debate around Putin in the West is much more like fierce than it is in Russia. So you have people who will literally think this guy's Hitler, and then other people who are like, no, how could you say anything bad about Putin? He's the best. And in Russia, people are just like, nah, I don't know, like whatever. He's a politician. Like, let's just I don't know. It's just people are just not as passionate about it here, and because Russians just understand, like they're not really part of the political system, and they're not part of the power structure at all, and Russians understand that. And so they're just not invested in this kind of stuff. And so what's actually I always say this, is that what's sort of refreshing about living in Russia is that Russians know that they don't live in a democracy, and and that's just, they just accept that, and then you go to the United States and you got to deal with the whole, red versus blue, and it's just Goldman Sachs wins every election. So it's like, why even bother? But, I don't know. It's like, but Russians are just much more laid back. They're like, yeah, okay, politicians, they suck.
I should know this, but is there some sort of exercise where people do vote or not? That you vote for Putin?
There is, but it's completely fake. I mean,
Yeah.
it's all rigged. And you know that they have online voting now in Russia, so you can vote online. And what happens is, right, that nobody shows up to vote. 800,000 online votes are cast, in the last 10 minutes of the election, and it's all completely fake and staged. And actually, in the most recent, there was a presidential election in, I want to say March. I always get this wrong. It was either March or April of this year. And this guy, Igor Strelkov, who is quite well known, he was involved in a lot of Ukraine stuff, who was sort of this conservative so-called turbo patriot. And he expressed some interest in running for president. And then on the left, you have this guy, Sergei Odaltsov, who is sort of this, he's like a leftist, but in American terms, he would be like a conservative. But anyway, both these guys expressed interest in running in the election, and they were both arrested. So it's like, there's not even any real, you don't really have a choice. It's like, you just vote for Putin or you don't vote, I guess.
So who actually decides who is in office after Putin? How does that work? Just insiders somehow?
So that's such a good question, because he's been in power now for basically 25 years. And so what comes after Putin is it's a really interesting and maybe scary question, because how does this system continue? Right. And are the mechanisms in place even to allow this system to continue, or are things going to fall apart after Putin eventually has to step down, whether through old age or who knows what? So that's a really good question. Nobody knows. There are theories about, maybe Putin has picked a successor, but I don't know.
So I should know this also, but is there voting at the local level at all is there any real voting, or how are local offices filled?
Yeah. So they can, you can vote for, your governor of your region, and things like that. And they have, you have parliament, the state Duma, and they also run. But listen, Russia is it's a uni-party system. So basically, you have the political party is called United Russia. And that's really the only political party. And there's like there's these smaller ones like the Communist Party and a few others, but they're all they're called like the systemic opposition, which means that they claim to represent different positions, but they always vote with the uniparty. They never actually oppose the government. So if you want, you can vote. For example, a really popular sort of smaller party is what is it called? A Just Russia. And these guys are supposed to be like more patriotic and more like based or whatever, but they always just vote with United Russia. So it's all, it's all fake. It's a totally fake system.
So when does the conflict in Ukraine end? Just whenever Putin decides, or is the will of the people part of the decision at all?
I mean, the current crisis. I mean, it's really scary because unfortunately, I don't. It might not end until a lot more people die, and I think that what's interesting about it though is that maybe in the West there's this perception that Putin wants the war to continue. I have a totally different reading. I think that he basically he wants to give up. I think that he's done. I think that the problem it's like it's causing actual instability within the Russian system. The problem is that Russia's basically trapped. Like it's stuck in a war that it can't really. There's no actual off ramp here. Like what possible political settlement can come from this conflict that will make the more favorable to Russia than the pre-war conditions. And Russia basically what it wanted or claimed that it wanted a neutral Ukraine. It wanted to prevent Ukraine from becoming a so-called anti-Russia, to be used by NATO to bludgeon Russia. It wanted the protection of Donbass and so-called denazification and demilitarization Ukraine. If you just go down the list, though, and also NATO expansion was a big thing. NATO has added 2 new members since the war started, Finland and Sweden. So that one, we've already failed. That goal has actually, the situation has gotten worse from Russia's perspective. Ukraine has never been more militarized in its entire history. Ukraine will never, ever be neutral towards Russia again, even if you get and to sign a piece of paper, relationships between 2 brotherly nations, probably for decades. I mean, it's absolute disaster. It's a catastrophe on such a large scale. I don't think people can process it. And I think that Putin would like to pull the plug, but like how to do it? Like, do you just pack up and leave? The problem is that Russia declared several regions of Ukraine to be Russian territory now. So Zaporozhia, Kherson, these areas are still partly occupied by Ukrainian military. So how do you get them off? You get them out. Donbass, the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, I think it's still somewhere around 40% of the declared territory is still occupied by the Ukrainian military. So after all this fighting, after all this bloodshed, even on the most basic military level, what has been accomplished and how do you actually, where's the solution, right? Where's the resolution? And so I don't know. I don't know what happens next. It's very frightening, though. It's really tragic. I wish that people would be more aware of just how bad the situation is from both sides. That it's been absolutely tragic for Ukraine. It's absolutely tragic for Russia. It sucks. Like, war sucks. This was a stupid war. Sorry, it's not a war. A special military operation. It's a stupid special military operation. And how it ends, though, is anyone's guess. I don't know. Maybe you have an idea.
I do not. I mean, 2 separate questions here. Do you think the U.S. taxpayers are getting great value for their money sent to fund this conflict? And do you think if Trump were to get back in office that the funding would be cut off, or it would help resolve the conflict somehow? Or
Well, if you get excited by tens of thousands of dead Slavs, then yeah, it's a wonderful investment. And in many ways, unfortunately, I have to say, like, if you're some neocon sitting in Washington, probably this has been the best investment of your life because you basically have been able to use a foreign state to invade Russia and massacre tens of thousands of Ukrainians and Russians for no reason whatsoever, accomplishing absolutely nothing besides mass destruction. And on top of all that, of course, Ukraine is by definition, it's publicly acknowledged by international organizations as the most corrupt country in Europe, even more corrupt than Russia. So if you hate Russia and you think that every dime you're spending is to defend liberty and stop the Russian menace, I guarantee a lot of it is going to Zelensky's personal cocaine stash or whatever. Like there's the idea that, any of this money is being spent in a responsible way to me is absolutely clownish and very naive. And sorry, what was the second question?
Oh, just if Trump were to come back in
Trump gets
office,
into
would that help
Yeah,
way
yeah.
or not? Yeah.
I wish I could say that I thought it would. I don't think so. I think that this is, even if Trump wanted to end it, I think it's out of his hands. Maybe if a government came into office, and obviously it would have to depend on whether you have a cooperative Congress to absolutely pull all funding. Maybe that would force Ukraine to the negotiating table, which would be one way to stop the bloodshed, which, I would welcome. But what's the likelihood of that happening? I mean, doesn't people want their Raytheon stock to continue going up, right? We got to think about Lockheed Martin. So, I don't know. I think that I guess that it would be nice to find some way to force Ukraine and Russia just to stop bombing and shooting each other. But at this point, maybe it's not even up to the United States anymore. Things have
So,
really unraveled to that point.
do you think that most of the soldiers that are actually there fighting and dying, that their heart is in it? They think they're fighting for freedom? Or you said on the Russian side, a lot of them are there because they're paid so well to be there?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, obviously, it's going to depend a little bit, but look, from the Ukrainian side, you have mass, basically a draft, which, as far as I understand, has been very, very unpopular, especially in certain regions of the country. You have like videos of basically, guys being dragged off and thrown into, military vans. They don't, probably a lot of these guys don't exactly know what they're fighting for and probably don't really like their own government that much. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they like Russia or support what Russia has done in Ukraine, but, I could totally understand. You're an average Ukrainian guy. You just want to live your life. You live under a very corrupt, incompetent, gross government, and now you have to fight for Zelensky. Like that's not a very fun idea to sit in a trench. On the other end of it, uh, yeah, it's at this point it's basically a mercenary army in the sense that they have to pay Russians huge amounts of money to go sit in a trench in Ukraine and wait for a suicide drone to kill them. I mean, it's a really cynical war. And by the way, on top of all this, which actually in a weird way sort of ties into Russia's stance on green energy or whatever. All this happening, and average Slav, there's trenches waiting to die. Gazprom, which is one of Russia's largest energy companies, maybe it is the largest, is paying the Ukrainian government to transit Russian gas across Ukraine to the European Union. And that's still happening. Even this fighting is occurring. In fact, and this is even more unbelievable, but it's absolutely true, is that the Ukrainian military right now occupies part of Oblast, which is traditional old Russia. And they occupy a town called Suzda. And in this town is this gas transit station that Gazprom uses. So the Ukrainian military is occupying the gas transit hub, which Gazprom is paying, while Gazprom is paying the Ukrainian government to transit its Russian gas across Ukraine to the European Union, which is funding, which is giving weapons and training and money to Ukraine to fight Russia. And all this is happening while average Russians and Ukrainians are dying. It's so cynical and so disgusting.
Do you have
Yeah.
any sense that these forever wars, that people are calling them correctly, I think, forever wars against either other countries or the forever war against carbon dioxide, do you think it's done somehow cynically to distract us from the debt problems or the fact that somehow there's going to be a complete financial meltdown upcoming? Is there anything to that?
Sure. Yeah, well, what's the best possible war that a government can fight? It should be a war against an enemy that isn't real, that can never be won, right? So, it's the forever war. I think is absolutely real. It's sort of like the war on terror, right? Like how it never ends, right? In fact, actually the benefit of the war on terror is that it creates more terror, and so then you have to keep fighting it. It's like this. It's the self-licking ice cream cone or whatever, and I think that you could even see it with what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, in some ways, I feel like these conflicts are never supposed to fully end. Maybe they stop. Maybe you have a little cool down, a frozen conflict. But the best wars at this point for, our space lizard overlords is one that is mostly managed, fighting an enemy that was never really your enemy or even existed in the first place, and requires huge amounts of resources, and also requires, of course, lots of censorship and surveillance to make sure that nobody is aiding the enemy or harming national interests. And it's this whole, it's this whole system. And this is how they keep the system, in place. And with environmental issues, the real tragedy, as I'm sure you know, is that there are many, if you have a huge amount of resources to help the environment, there are many environmental problems that are very real that we could be, addressing. But instead, we're chasing CO2 emissions, and stopping cows from farting. And it's like it's so disgusting.
So, do you think there's any hope to this whole idea of fixing the money and fixing the world? That if we stop the money printing, maybe with a Bitcoin standard, that governments can't afford the forever wars anymore? Uh, How can we stop
I
the
mean,
forever wars? Yeah.
that's such a good question. I hope that the solution, obviously. No, like how do we get out of this cycle? Like how do you stop the forever war? It's such a that's a question that we need an answer to. Maybe it really is it just comes down to stopping the printing presses, right? Like stopping this insane monetary system and financial system which feeds off of this absolute nonsense, this like incomprehensible word salad, which unfortunately also leads to so much death and destruction. So, yeah.
I'm just curious if there was an honest referendum in Russia right now. Do you want to keep up this conflict in Ukraine? Are you gung ho behind it? What percentage of the actual people in Russia are really into it? And they would say, "Yep, let's keep doing this." It
I
can't be
think
that high.
actually, I think there's actually already been polls, like official polls done in Russia, which show that if majority, like close to a majority, are ready for just some kind of settlement. But of course, there's always like on Russia's terms, or there's some sort of way to make it acceptable for public consumption. But look, I really do feel like if you ask the average Russian, like, is your heart in this thing? I think most Russians would just say, like, I don't even know what this is about anymore. And I know for a fact because I live in this village, and I've spoken with people who have friends who have fought in Ukraine. A lot of the people doing the fighting don't even know what this war is about anymore. You know, like, it's just unreal. What's happening in Russia I mean, obviously all over the world, but we live in very strange times, very surreal.
So we're coming up on an hour here. Any other points you'd like to make before we finish up?
Uh, no, look, despite all of the insanity around us, I guess I would just say, try not to, we should do our best, still seek out the things in life that make life worth living, because I do think there's quite a lot of that, and there are reasons for hope. I mean, I really, really like my life actually here in Russia. I really love my village. I like milking my cows, and I guess what I would say is, there's maybe on a certain level we have to accept that we're not going to be able to change some of these crazy things around us, but we can change ourselves, and maybe that will make things more tolerable. I don't know. Yeah,
All right. And then I'm putting a link in the show description. You are Edward Slavsquat on Substack, right? Is
that's
that the
correct.
place we can find your work? Okay.
That's
Is there any story behind that name?
Yeah, it was just a joke pen name that I came up with when I started writing about like COVID issues. So I just sort of stuck with it. And but yeah, it's a joke on Edward Snowden actually. So yeah.
All right. All right. Thank you very much. I really am interested in your work, and thanks for doing it. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's been great talking.
Talk to you next time.